Welcome to A Guide to Every Deck in Modern. Today we're looking at Mono Black Coffers. Mono Black Coffers is a hybrid ramp control deck that seeks to abuse the synergy between Cabal Coffers and Urborg. With Urborg in play, Cabal Coffers costs 2 mana to generate mana equal to your land count, including Coffers itself. Once you reach 5 or more lands, you can generate an obscene amount of mana, especially if you have multiple Coffers. For this reason, the deck is often referred to as Mono Black Tron. To ensure it finds what it needs, the deck runs Expedition Map and Profane Tutor to search for Coffers and Urborg amongst other cards. A number of special lands may be run in the deck, including Blaststone to deal with pesky permanents, Bojuka Bog for graveyard hate, Castle Locthwain for card draw, and Takenuma as a free black land that can retrieve large creatures or planeswalkers. Cascading Cataracts is also a card used to combo with Golos, more on that later. Discard spells Thoughtseize and Inquisition, along with cheap removal like Fatal Push and Bloodchief's Thirst, control the early game and help you set up for the late game. Cling to Dust can either gain life against aggressive decks or draw cards, and is also main deckable graveyard hate. The late game is what's important, and the deck must do everything it can to stabilize early to reach it. Damnation provides additional outs to large or many creatures. Liliana the Veil performs a dual role as removal and hand hate and is important as such since you'll want to sideboard out many cards that perform one half of her role or the other in various matchups. Golos, so good it was banned in EDH Tireless Pilgrim, is a medium-sized body that tutors for Coffers or Urborg, or alternatively, Cascading Cataracts in order to filter black into the rainbow mana needed to activate its triple free cast ability, making it a must-answer threat. Karn the Great Creator is the best threat since it's the cheapest and can tutor for various hate cards and silver bullets, as well as large mana sinks and threats, or function as a win condition itself in combination with Liquimetal Coating. Currently, the best threats Karn can wish for are Walking Ballista, which can often win the game on the spot given the deck's absurd mana output, a 4th copy of Golos in the sideboard, Bolas's Citadel. Citadel obviously requires a high life total to function, but when you have a high life total, this card is bananas. It allows you to play tons of removal and threats off the top of your deck for 0 mana and can often win the game by itself. It's so good that I'd run at least 1 copy in the main deck as well. There are a ton of things to do with Citadel that I'll cover later in the tips and tricks section. Other large main deck threats include Archon of Cruelty and Emrakul the Promised End. The deck can afford to skimp on multiple copies of cards due to Profane Tutor, especially expensive win cons. Some absent cards worth highlighting are Gristlebrand and Invoke Despair. Gristlebrand first. Gristlebrand isn't good in this deck for a few reasons. There's no combo that you can find with it in the same vein as Neobrand or Reanimator decks, and you often don't have enough life to pay for its ability or even to afford to pay for it. Additionally, unlike Archon, Emrakul, or Citadel, it provides no immediate value beyond its large body, which is often irrelevant in the face of cards like Solitude and Teferi Time Raveler. Invoke Despair, while it can be good, pretty much requires that your opponent sacrifice 1 or 2 high-value permanents for it to be worthwhile. The life loss doesn't matter to Coffer's game plan since it can't pressure the opponent's life total anyway, and spending 5 mana to draw 3 or pick off tiny creatures usually isn't worth it. Sideboarding. The deck has a lot of dead or low-value cards in many matchups, primarily its removal. However, a large amount of the sideboard is devoted to wish targets for Karn, unless you're playing the Reanimator version. To that end, it's important to run cards that are flexible. Dauthi Voidwalker is the best option for a multi-use sideboard card. It's graveyard hate and a powerful threat for cheap. Opponents will likely sideboard out most of their removal since the deck doesn't play cheap creatures in the main, although there are enough creatures to keep in some removal, especially on Holy Heat since it also targets Karn and Liliana. To quickly go over the rest, Nile Spellbomb is for graveyard hate. It's better than Relic of Progenitus since the deck has some of its own graveyard synergies. Pithing Needle for any abilities you need to shut off, notably Wrenn and Six, Viseiju, Urza's Saga, etc. Torpor Orb for ETB decks such as Yorion or Amulet Titan. Ensnaring Bridge for defense, especially against linear aggro decks. Liquimetal Coating to combo with Karn, slowly picking off the opponent's lands. Bolas's Citadel, Golos, and Walking Ballista as threats for various decks. Notably, I don't think Wormcoil Engine is worth running since the other 3 are almost always better. Chalice of the Void for Cascade decks or to disrupt specific combos. For example, it's the only card Karn can wish for that stops Scapeshift. Engineered Explosives is primarily for Rhino and Karnstruck tokens versus Crashing Footfalls and Urza's Saga, though you can also play it on 1 for decks like Hammer Time. It's my opinion that it's better than Ratchet Bomb since you can put it on 1 immediately, whereas you have to wait a turn for Bomb. Although Bomb can hypothetically hit cards of higher mana values, it takes so long that in practice you're better off with EE's immediacy. If you have any open spots on the sideboard, I'd recommend Torok since it's good for grindy matchups, especially white control decks. How to beat it. The deck's primary issues are threefold. 1. Coffers is a terrible land when you don't have Urborg. You need 3 swamps minimum for it to even generate mana, and having one in your opening hand can lead to forced mulligans. 2. While the deck has powerful cards for when it generates a lot of mana, it doesn't have a high enough density of them. If you exclude Profane Tutor and Golos, since you have to wait for Suspend and for Cataracts to untap, the deck only has around 7 actual bombs. This often leads to situations where you have tons of mana and nothing to do with it. 3. Expanding on the last point, the deck has an unfilled hole in its mana curve around the 2 to 3 cost range. It desperately wants another Karn or Liliana type threat that just doesn't exist at the moment. An alternate build is to play as a Reanimator deck, cutting the control threats like Karn for more copies of Archon of Cruelty and its reanimation enablers Persist and Unmarked Grave. Mono Black Coffers is a relatively new deck, and the optimal build is by no means settled. While the deck requires the core synergy of Coffers and Urborg, beyond those 2 cards, it's possible that any number of changes could be made, including running radically different cards, changing the deck's archetype, splashing into other colors, and so on. There are 3 main ways to fight the deck. 1. Get underneath the deck's late game by going faster with aggro or combo. 2. Outvalue the deck. Good candidates are Tron, 4-color Omnath Piles, and Blue-White Control. This is not to say that those are necessarily favored matchups, but that they have the ability to do so. 3. Disrupt its mana production. Primarily you'll want to target Urborg since Coffers sucks without it. I see many players unfamiliar with the deck go for Coffers instead. Blood Moon can work, though, like Tron, the deck will eventually draw out of it and has enough basic swamps to ignore the color restriction. Coffers' best matchups tend to be the same ones as other big mono decks like Tron, e.g. Jund and slower mid-range value decks. It's particularly good against Affinity and other cheap artifact decks since it has a combination of efficient removal and discard spells, Damnation, and Karn to shut off artifacts. Tips and tricks. As in every other case, Karn can retrieve cards from exile. You can exile your own cards via Nile Spellbomb and by escaping or targeting them with Cling to Dust. Using Golos as a win condition is unreliable since the deck has such a low density of meaningful threats. Sure, you can flip over Emrakul or Archon of Cruelty, but you're more likely to find ineffective trios like Double Land Fatal Push. Only use Golos if you don't have better options. You may wonder why the deck is running fetch lands given that it's a monocolor deck. There are 3 reasons. 1, they enable Revolt for Fatal Push. 2, they're graveyard fodder for escaping Cling to Dust and adding to Delirium for Emrakul. And 3, they let you change the top card of your deck with Bolas's Citadel. Speaking of Citadel, you can get stuck in a number of ways. If there's a land on top and you've already played your land for turn, or by expensive cards you can't afford the life payment on, or by cards that have no legal target, such as Fatal Push when there are no creatures. But there are a ton of ways to draw cards or change the top card, including fetch lands, Expedition Map, Golos either by its ETB trigger or activating it, Cling to Dust, Castle Locthwain and Takenuma, Karn fetching either Nile Spellbomb or Golos, Archon of Cruelty's trigger to draw. If Profane Tutor is on top, you can cast it for free with Citadel. If there's an instant underneath it, you can hold priority and cast the instant before you search with Tutor. The same goes for any search effect such as Golos. Be careful not to go too low on life with Citadel and expose yourself to danger, especially against decks running burn spells like Lightning Bolt. You can animate Citadel with Karn for a 6/6 attacker should you need it. If you have the option to suspend Profane Tutor or do something else, it's usually correct to suspend Tutor. Escaping Cling to Dust directly competes with fueling Emrakul via the graveyard. It's important to think about how future turns are going to play out, if doing so is worth it, and which cards you need to leave behind if you have more than 5. You can always pay for escape with instants, since Cling to Dust is an instant itself. If you can tutor for either Coffers or Urborg, find Urborg first, since Coffers is usually a dead card without it. If you're activating Expedition Map and already have both Coffers and Urborg, it's usually correct to find a value-generating land like Castle Locthwain or Takenuma rather than more Coffers. As with any deck playing Urborg, keep in mind whether you're giving the opponent access to a color they need but don't have. In the mirror match, sideboard out all but one Urborg since you still want the ability to go off but don't want to enable your opponent to do the same. Keep in mind that Damnation stops regeneration, useful against things like Welding Jar and Thrun the Last Troll. If you play the Reanimator version, Thought-Seizing yourself is a way to get Archon into the graveyard for Persist. I hope you've enjoyed this look at Mono Black Coffers. I want to thank my fellow players in the Magic community for whom sharing their experiences helps make these guides possible. You can find additional resources, such as an up-to-date deck list, in the description. If you think I left out anything important or got something wrong, please leave your thoughts in the comments, and stay tuned to see what deck we look at next time.